The morning they laughed at her, Maris Holloway had exactly $43 left in the world. Not $43 until payday. Not $43 in her checking account while the rest sat somewhere else. $43. Total. In a cracked leather coin purse her mother had left behind. And Earl Denton, the man who ran the livestock auction like he owned the county and everyone in it, snatched the purse right out of her hand, flipped it open in front of the whole crowd, and counted her coins out loud. $43, he announced, grinning at the men around him. Little Maris Holloway, saving the family farm one chicken at a time. The laughter hit her like a slap. But here's what Earl Denton never understood, what none of them understood. By the time that winter ended, every single one of those laughing men would be standing at her door with their hat in their hand. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow it all the way to the end. Because what happens next is something nobody in that county ever forgot. Hit the like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction yard smelled like mud and old hay, and the particular kind of desperation that collects in places where people sell things they can't afford to keep anymore. Maris Holloway stood near the back fence, with her arms crossed over her wool coat, the coat with the torn pocket she'd been meaning to fix for 2 winters now, and watched the morning's early lots move through without bidding on anything. She couldn't afford to waste attention on something that wasn't going to matter. She had come for one thing, and she was going to wait for it. Around her, the men talked the way men at auctions always talked, loud enough to be heard, confident enough to sound like they knew more than everyone else. She'd grown up listening to that particular sound. Her father's voice had carried that same quality whenever he stood among other farmers, even in the years when the farm was bleeding money and he came home and sat at the kitchen table without speaking for an hour. She was 31 years old, and she had been running that farm alone for 14 months. The Holloway place sat 8 miles east of Carver's Crossing, tucked into a long valley that trapped cold air in winter and baked everything dry in August. Her father had worked it for 30 years and left behind 2 things when his heart gave out the previous spring: a deed to 212 acres and a debt to the First Agricultural Bank of Carver's Crossing that came to $11,400. $11,400 on land that had produced almost nothing last season because Maris had inherited it mid-planting and didn't have the capital to run the operation her father had been building toward. The cattle were gone, sold to cover the first 6 months of loan payments. The upper fields sat fallow. The old equipment shed had a roof that was mostly rust and optimism. What she had left was the farmhouse, the chicken coop her grandmother had built in 1962, $43, and a very specific piece of knowledge that she had never told anyone because no one had ever asked. She knew about the Chanticleer. Boatmen. Lot 47 came through the gate at 10:30, and Maris straightened up the moment she saw them. 29 hens moved in a loose, unhappy cluster, their feathers patchy and dull, their combs pale, their bodies thin from what looked like a long stretch of inadequate feeding. They were not beautiful birds. They were not the kind of birds that made a farmer feel pride when he looked at his flock. They looked, honestly, like something that had been through a hard argument with winter and hadn't quite won. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Jeb Cully, who wore the same canvas vest every single week and had never been seen without a toothpick in the corner of his mouth, gestured at the lot with visible lack of enthusiasm. 29 laying hens, mixed condition, seller's estate lot. Who wants to start me at $15? Nobody moved. Maris moved her lips, counting the birds. 29. She'd been hoping for closer to 20, but 29 was manageable if she could get the price low enough. $10? 10 for the lot? A man near the front, Harlan Pruitt, who ran the biggest egg operation in the county, turned and looked at the birds and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite disgust, but landed somewhere between the two. "Those are Chanticleers," he said, mostly to the man standing next to him. "Dead breeds walking. You put those out in a real winter, and you'll be picking up frozen chickens come February." The man next to him shook his head. "I wouldn't take those for free." $5, Jeb Cully said, with the tone of a man who had already accepted that this lot was going to be a problem. Maris raised her hand. $5. The yard went quiet for a second. Not the respectful kind of quiet, but the kind that happens when something unexpected cuts through the noise, and people aren't sure whether to laugh yet. "5 from the Holloway girl," Jeb called. "She's serious?" someone said behind her. "Lord help her," said someone else. And then the laughter started. Not vicious at first, more like the automatic, unthinking laughter of men who have already decided they know what's funny before they've looked at it closely. Nobody countered the bid. $5. Going once? Earl Denton stepped away from the fence where he'd been leaning and walked toward Maris at a slow, deliberate pace that made it clear he wanted an audience before he arrived. Earl was 56 years old, ran the county's feed supply, sat on the bank's advisory board, and had been suggesting in various ways over the past 14 months that the Holloway farm would be better off in other hands. Specifically, in his hands, as part of the land expansion he'd been orchestrating along the East Valley. He stopped in front of Maris, and he smiled the way people smile when they already know the joke and are enjoying watching someone else walk into it. "Maris," he said, "those are Chanticleer. You know what a Chanticleer is?" "I do," she said. "Old breed, nearly extinct for a reason." He glanced back at the men around him, making sure they were paying attention. "Nobody keeps Chanticleers anymore. They're slow to mature, they're small-bodied, they don't produce at the rate that makes any kind of economic sense." "Going twice," Jeb Cully said, without much conviction. "And in a hard winter," Earl continued, raising his voice just slightly to compete with the auctioneer. "Those birds are going to sit in your coop and freeze and stop laying just like every other breed, and you will have wasted—" He reached out, and before she could pull it back, lifted the coin purse from where it was tucked under her arm. "Whatever you have left." He flipped it open. He counted out loud. When he was done, the laughter was not the polite kind anymore. Maris took the purse back from him without a word, without a change in her expression, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She had practiced that stillness for 14 months. She had practiced it every time she opened a bank statement, every time she drove past the East Fields and did the math on what it would take to plant them again. Every time she lay awake at 3 a.m, listening to the farmhouse settle and trying not to calculate how many months were left before the bank ran out of patience. "Sold," said Jeb Cully. $5 to Maris Holloway. She borrowed a crate from the auction yard and loaded the birds herself. Nobody helped her, which she had expected. A few men watched with the particular kind of attention people give to something they're planning to use as a story later, something they'll tell at the feed store. Something they'll bring up in 6 months when things go wrong, and they want to say they'd seen it coming. The birds were calm as she handled them, which surprised her a little. Most hens in that state, underfed, stressed, recently transported, would be jumpy and difficult to manage. These ones moved into the crate with a kind of exhausted cooperation, as if they understood that this particular ordeal was different from the last one. Her truck was a 1987 Ford that had belonged to her father, and it started on the 3rd try. It always started on the 3rd try. She had stopped worrying about that particular ritual months ago. The drive back to the farm took 40 minutes on roads that were already developing the hard gray look of late autumn, the trees stripped down and the fields gone brown and the skies settling into the flat, heavy color that meant the cold was coming and not bluffing about it this time. She drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the cracked vinyl of the seat beside her, and she thought about her grandmother. Edna Holloway had kept Chanticleers for 30 years on this same land, on this same farm, in the coop that Maris now used. She talked about them the way some people talk about reliable old friends, with a certain quiet confidence that didn't require argument, that simply existed alongside the evidence. "Other breeds stop laying when the cold comes," she'd said once, sitting across from 12-year-old Maris at the kitchen table, shelling field peas into a metal bowl. "They spend their energy keeping warm. A Chanticleer was built different, smaller comb, tighter feathering. The cold doesn't take as much from them, so they've got more left for the laying." Maris had been 12 and had listened the way 12-year-olds listen to grandmothers, with one ear, storing things without knowing she was storing them, filing information in places she wouldn't know to look for it until she needed it. She needed it now. The neighbors noticed the truck before she'd finished unloading. She had not expected privacy exactly, but she had hoped for a few days before the commentary started. The Hendersons' place shared a fence line with the Holloway Farm's north edge, and Calvin Henderson was a man who had opinions about farming the way some people have opinions about weather, constantly, confidently, and often incorrectly. He was standing at the fence when she carried the second crate toward the coop. "Those aren't laying hens," he said. "They will be," she said. "Maris?" He stopped and tried a different approach, the one people use when they want to sound helpful while actually landing a point. "I heard what you paid for those at the auction. $5 for the lot. You know why nobody else bid?" "I have a pretty good idea." "Because there's nothing wrong with the price. The price is fine. The problem is those are Chanticleers, and nobody's kept Chanticleers in this county since—" He paused, trying to remember. "Since your grandmother, I think. And that was a long time ago." "That's right," she said. "Your grandmother was an eccentric woman." Maris stopped walking and looked at him over the top of the crate. "My grandmother fed her family through 3 bad winters on those birds, Calvin." He opened his mouth and closed it again. "The cold's coming early this year," she said. "Everybody's saying so. My grandmother knew something about cold." She carried the crate into the coop and didn't wait to see his expression. Wow. The coop was solid, mostly. Her grandmother had built it with a carpenter's stubbornness, thick-walled and oriented with the door facing south to catch what warmth the winter sun could offer. But 14 months of minimal attention had let things slide. There were gaps at the base of 2 walls where a groundhog or something similar had worked at the wood. The insulation, layers of straw bales her grandmother had stacked against the outer walls, had compressed and thinned. One of the ventilation covers had come loose and was letting in a cold draft that moved through the coop with a persistence that made Maris put her hand flat against the wall and feel the air moving under her palm. She'd known this was coming. She'd been adding to a list on a notepad on the kitchen counter for the past 3 weeks. Materials she needed, repairs that had to happen before the temperature dropped below 20. The problem was that she now had $38 and some change, and the list was longer than that. She sat down on an overturned bucket in the coop and looked at the birds, who had begun to explore their new space with cautious, deliberate movements, and she did the math that she had already done 17 times in her head. Straw bales, $6 for a dozen, and she needed at least 4 dozen to do the job properly. Lumber for the gap repairs, maybe $12 if she bought only what she needed and cut carefully. Hardware cloth for the ground-level gaps, $8. Feed to get the birds back to condition before the serious cold arrived. She'd need to stretch what she had and supplement with kitchen scraps and whatever she could find in the root cellar that wasn't worth selling. The numbers didn't work. They almost worked. The way things almost work when you're desperate enough to want them to. But almost wasn't good enough for a winter that the sky was already promising would be serious. She had a chainsaw, a father's old toolbox, and 60 acres of timber on the farm's back edge that she hadn't touched. She picked up the notepad. She crossed out "buy lumber" and wrote, "cut it." She spent the next week doing things that made her body hurt in new places every morning. The timber work was harder than she'd expected because she'd done it before with her father, and the memory of how it went with 2 people kept interrupting the reality of how it went alone. She felled 4 small trees, limbed them badly the first day, and better the second day, hauled sections to the farm on the tractor and ran them through the old bandsaw in the equipment shed that took 3 attempts to get running and then smelled like burning for the first hour before it settled into a functional, grudging rhythm. The boards she cut were uneven. Real lumber, proper dimensional lumber from a hardware store, would have been faster and cleaner. But what she cut was real wood, and it was free, and it fit the gaps when she forced it to. She sealed the walls on a Tuesday in temperatures that had dropped into the low 30s overnight, her hands going numb inside her work gloves, stopping every 20 minutes to go inside and hold them under warm running water and then go back out. She found she had enough straw from the farm's own supply to pack 3 sides properly if she was willing to open the old bales her father had left in the equipment shed. Dusty, compressed, but still insulating. The birds watched her work. That was the strange part. She kept noticing it. Most chickens ignore people who aren't bringing food, but these birds would stop what they were doing and orient toward her with a kind of attention that felt, unreasonably, like they were tracking her progress. "I'm doing my best," she told them once, out loud, and then immediately felt foolish. But she didn't stop talking to them after that. You do things alone long enough and the audience stops mattering. Such as It was on a Friday evening, when she was climbing down off the ladder after finishing the last section of wall insulation, that she heard the truck. She knew the sound of Earl Denton's truck the way you know the sound of something you've learned to be alert to. The particular rattle of the tailgate, the engine note that was a little too smooth because he had it serviced every 3 months at the shop in town, the small things that accumulate into recognition. He pulled up to the fence gate and got out without being invited, which was also something she'd expected. "Heard you've been busy," he said. "Word gets around," she said. He looked at the coop, at the new boards visible along the base, at the straw bales stacked and tied against the walls. He had the expression of a man inspecting something he was considering purchasing. Not impressed exactly, but assessing. "Maris," he said, "I want to be straight with you, because I've known your family a long time." She waited. "The bank is going to want a payment in January. The full quarter, not a partial. I sit on the advisory board, as you know, and I've had conversations—" He stopped, recalibrating. "The point is that a farm this size, in this condition, with no cattle operation and no primary crop revenue, is going to have a very hard time demonstrating to the bank that it's a viable, ongoing enterprise." "I'm aware of my loan terms," she said. "I'm sure you are." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not actually agreeing with anything. "I'm offering again, Maris. Same offer as before. Fair market value, as assessed by my own appraiser. I'll cover the bank debt out of the purchase price, and you'll come out of this with something in your pocket instead of nothing." The sun had dropped behind the tree line, and the cold was moving in hard, the way it did in this valley when evening came. Maris could feel it on the back of her neck. "Those birds go into a good winter," she said, "and this farm pays for itself." 29 Chanticleers, Earl said, and the dismissal in his voice was total, the kind of certainty that doesn't leave room for argument because it has already ruled out every counterpoint. "Maris, come on." "I need to go feed them," she said. "Thanks for stopping by, Earl." She turned and walked toward the coop, and she did not look back, and after a moment she heard his truck door open and close, and the engine start and the rattle of the tailgate fading down the road. Inside the coop, 29 birds turned toward her with that particular attention she'd started to recognize, and the smell of warm straw and the particular dusty heat of living animals surrounded her. She filled the feeders slowly, making the feed go further than the bag recommended, supplementing with the kitchen scraps she'd brought in a bucket. Potato peels, the outside leaves of cabbages, corn silk she'd dried in the fall. She checked the water, checked the roost bars she'd reinforced with scraps of the dimensional lumber, checked the draft cover she'd secured with wire and a block of wood. Everything was as good as she could make it. Outside, the temperature was falling, and the sky had the dense, colorless look of a sky that was making plans. She latched the coop door behind her and stood in the dark for a moment, her breath coming out in puffs that were visible even in the limited light from the farmhouse windows. She did not feel confident. She wanted to be clear about that, even to herself. She felt something closer to the particular stubbornness that comes from having no alternative, the kind that isn't quite the same as hope, but fills a similar space. She'd planted seeds in bad soil before. She'd fixed equipment that should have been replaced. She'd made do with what was available so many times that making do had stopped feeling like deprivation and started feeling like just the way things worked. She went inside and made a pot of soup from what was in the root cellar, and sat at her grandmother's kitchen table with her grandmother's notepad and wrote out very carefully everything she needed to do before the first real freeze. The list was long. She started at the top. The freeze came on a Wednesday. Not a slow freeze, not the kind that eases in over a week and gives you time to adjust. It came the way serious weather sometimes does in that part of the country. A front that dropped out of the northwest overnight and had the temperature at 11 degrees by the time Maris's alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning. The kind of cold that doesn't feel like a season changing. It feels like a door slamming. She was dressed before she was fully awake, the way you get dressed when you've been doing pre-dawn barn chores long enough that your hands know where the layers are without your brain having to manage it. Long underwear, heavy wool socks, the canvas work pants her father had left hanging on the same hook for 20 years, 2 sweaters, the coat with the torn pocket. She'd sewn the pocket back together 2 weeks ago. Small things accumulate. The thermometer on the back porch read 9 degrees when she stepped outside, and the cold hit the inside of her nose like something sharp and physical. The sky was clear and black and enormous in the way winter skies are when there's no cloud cover to soften the dark, and her boots made a hard, dry sound on the frozen ground that was different from any other sound. That particular creak and compression of earth that had locked up overnight and wasn't planning to thaw anytime soon. She walked to the coop with her flashlight and her feed bucket and her stomach doing something it had been doing every morning for the past 6 days, since the temperature first started dropping into the 20s, a low, tight feeling that she recognized as the place where worry lives when you've decided not to give it too much room. She unlatched the coop door. The warmth that came out was not the warmth of a heated building. There was no heat lamp in the coop, no electric element, nothing artificial. What came out was the accumulated warmth of 29 living bodies in an insulated space, a biological heat that smelled like straw and feathers, and the specific earthiness of chickens going about their business, and it was enough. She could feel it on her face. The birds were awake and moving, which was the first thing. In cold this serious, birds that were struggling would be huddled and still, their energy going to maintenance rather than function. These birds were at the feeders, at the water, moving with the ordinary, slightly irritable efficiency of animals that had a lot to accomplish before the day was done. She checked the water first. She'd installed a simple bucket warmer the week before, a coiled element that ran off a heavy-duty extension cord from the equipment shed, drawing about as much power as a light bulb. It had kept the water at just above freezing, not warm, but liquid, which was all that mattered. She checked the roost bars. She checked the ventilation, tight enough to stop drafts, open enough that moisture wouldn't build up inside and cause the respiratory problems that kill more confined birds in winter than the cold itself does. She'd read about that in one of her grandmother's old extension bulletins, a mimeographed sheet from the 1970s that she'd found folded inside a copy of a poultry almanac on the kitchen shelf. Then she checked the nest boxes. 6 eggs. In a single morning. From birds that had been thin and stressed and half featherless 6 weeks ago. She stood there for a moment with the eggs cupped in both hands. She hadn't brought the collection basket yet, hadn't thought she'd need it this early in the season, and she did not perform the emotion she felt. She just felt it. A quiet, specific relief that went all the way down to somewhere she'd been keeping clenched for 14 months. 6 eggs was not a business. 6 eggs was not salvation. But 6 eggs on the first real morning of a serious freeze from birds that everyone at that auction had written off as already dead was something. She carried them inside in her coat pockets and put them on the kitchen counter and made coffee and stood looking at them while the coffee brewed. Then she went back out to fill the water and the feeders properly because the morning was still early and there was a lot more of it to get through. By the end of the first week of the freeze, she was averaging 11 eggs a day. She knew better than to put too much weight on averages that early. She'd watched her father get excited about early numbers before, watched him plan around projections that didn't hold. But 11 eggs a day was 11 eggs a day, which was 77 eggs a week, which was somewhere between 4 and 5 dozen, and she already knew from the prices at the Carver's Crossing General Store that a dozen eggs were going for $2.50 in good weather. She did the math on the back of the notepad. She crossed it out and did it again because the first answer seemed too small. Then she crossed it out again because the second answer required the birds to keep producing at a rate she hadn't verified yet, and she'd learned from her father's example that building on projections was how you ended up owing money you didn't have. She sold her first dozen to Ruth Hensley, who ran the post office and lived alone and had mentioned twice in passing that her own chickens had stopped laying 2 weeks before the freeze arrived. Ruth paid $2.50 without hesitation and then said, "These are fresh? From yesterday?" "From this morning," Maris said. Ruth looked at the eggs in the carton. Saved paper cartons, the kind she'd been collecting from the general store for months, folded flat and stored in a paper bag under the counter. And then she looked at Maris with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and almost suspicious, the way people look when something works out better than they'd been told to expect. "My hens quit 3 weeks ago," Ruth said. "Every one of them. Haven't seen an egg since the middle of October." "What breed?" "Rhode Island Reds, always been good layers." "They're good layers in good weather," Maris said, and then stopped herself because it wasn't Ruth's fault and it wasn't the right time to make a point. "They'll come back in spring. They're just conserving in the cold." "Yours aren't," Ruth said. Different birds, Maris said, and let it go at that. She drove home with $2.50 in her pocket, and the particular feeling of a person who has just proven something small but real, and she put the money in the coffee can on the counter. Her grandmother's coffee can, a blue Maxwell House tin that her grandmother had used for the same purpose. And she cooked dinner and went to bed at 8:30 because 4:30 came fast. The second week of the freeze was colder. The low on Tuesday was 3 degrees, and the wind came with it this time, cutting in from the northwest with a persistence that found every gap in every structure and demonstrated, without mercy, exactly how inadequate everything was. Maris lost half a day to the equipment shed, where the wind had worked under the eave and was threatening the roof section above the bandsaw. She fixed it with lumber scraps and roofing nails and a roll of tar paper she found behind the seed storage, working with her back to the wind because that was the only way to keep the nails from blowing off the work surface. She arrived at the coop that afternoon later than she'd intended, already tired in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day, and she found Calvin Henderson standing outside the coop door. He was not inside. He had not opened the door without permission, which she appreciated more than she would have a year ago, before she'd spent 14 months learning exactly which courtesies mattered when you were operating alone and everything you had was fragile. He was just standing there with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the coop. "Calvin," she said. He turned around. He looked embarrassed, which was not an expression she associated with Calvin Henderson. "Didn't want to go in without you," he said. "What's going on?" He blew out a breath that turned white in the cold air. "My operation's down," he said. "Completely. All 60 birds. Haven't gotten an egg in a week and a half." Maris said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. "I've got a standing order with the Carver's Crossing School cafeteria," he continued. 20 dozen a week through March. Contract I signed in September. He stopped. Started again. "I can't fill it." "What breed are you running?" "Leghorns, good producers, reliable." He caught himself. "Usually reliable." She understood then what he was here for, and she understood that it had cost him something to come, and she decided not to make it cost him more than it already had. "Come inside," she said. "Let's see what we've got." She opened the coop door and they both stepped in, and Calvin Henderson stood in the warm, active space with 29 birds moving around his boots, and he was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when something has contradicted something they were certain about. "They're laying," he said, "every day. In this cold." "That's the thing about Chanticleer," she said. She was not trying to be cutting, she was just stating the fact. They were developed specifically for cold climate laying. The small comb, the tight feathering, they don't spend everything just staying warm. They've got reserves. Calvin looked at the nest boxes, at the eggs in them, at the birds moving with ordinary, healthy confidence in a temperature that had stopped every other laying operation in the county. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me an order," she said. "We can talk about the apology later." Something shifted in his face. Surprise first, then something that was probably respect, though it was too new to be comfortable yet. "What can you supply?" "Right now, about 12 to 15 eggs a day. That's going to go up as the birds come fully into condition. They were underweight when I got them." She did the math as she spoke, which was a thing she'd learned to do early. Never commit to a number until you've run it in your head first. "I can do 1 dozen a week to the cafeteria right now, possibly 2 by the end of January." "That's not 20, he said. "No," she said. "It's not. But it's something, and right now something is what you've got." He was quiet. She let him be quiet because she knew from experience that sometimes people need a moment to arrive at a decision they've already made. $2.75 a dozen, he said. "That's what the cafeteria pays me." "I know what the cafeteria pays," she said. "I'll take $2.60. You keep 15 cents a dozen for handling." She didn't know if the number was right. She'd done some calculations, but not enough to be certain. What she knew was that $2.60 a dozen for as many dozens as her birds could produce would make a difference that $5 for the whole flock had not made, and making the deal now, in this coop, on this afternoon, was better than waiting. Calvin Henderson nodded. "Deal," he said. They did not shake hands. It was too cold for gloves to come off, and they both understood that the agreement was already real. The cold did not relent in January. If anything, it settled in with a kind of grim permanence that began to feel less like a weather event and more like a condition, a new baseline that the county was simply going to have to learn to operate inside of. The creek at the north edge of the Holloway property froze solid enough to walk on by the second week of January, which hadn't happened in 11 years, according to Calvin, who had been tracking such things in a notebook he kept in his barn. Dates of first frost, depth of snow, temperature extremes, the kind of granular record-keeping that farmers do when they've lived long enough to understand that patterns matter. Maris was averaging 14 eggs a day by the third week of January. On good days, 16. The birds had come back into full condition faster than she'd expected, the extra feed and the kitchen supplementing doing what she'd hoped. Their feathers had filled in, their combs had colored up, their weight had come back to where a laying hen's weight should be, and they were working. She had 3 customers by then. Ruth Hensley, who had become a standing weekly order of 1 dozen. Calvin Henderson's cafeteria arrangement, which had moved to 2 dozen a week as she'd promised. And a new one, Patrice Odom, who ran the diner on the main road through Carver's Crossing and who had come to Maris through Ruth, which was the way most things traveled in that county, through Ruth, who knew everything and told it selectively. Patrice was 54 years old and had been running the diner for 22 years and did not waste time on pleasantries when she didn't have to. "You've got eggs?" she said, standing in Maris's kitchen on a Tuesday morning with her coat still on, because she'd said she could only stay a few minutes. "I do," Maris said. "My supplier in Millhaven called me last week. He's down. His whole operation's frozen out." Patrice looked at Maris directly in the way that people who've been running businesses for a long time look at people they're considering doing business with, evaluating, not unkindly, but not softening it either. "What can you do for me?" "Right now I can do 2 dozen a week," Maris said. "That'll go up in February." "I need 4 dozen a week minimum to run my breakfast menu," Patrice said. 2 dozen. I have to cut the menu." "Then cut the menu for now," Maris said, "and have a full menu in February." Patrice looked at her. "I can't promise you 4 dozen a week right now," Maris said, "and I won't promise what I can't deliver. You can have what I actually have, or you can find another source." She let that sit for a moment. "You're here, which means you haven't found another source." Patrice was quiet for a moment that Maris counted internally and did not fill. $2.80 a dozen, Patrice said. "That's diner pricing. I can't go higher." $2.70, Maris said. "Delivered Tuesdays." "I don't need delivery. I'll pick up." $2.70 then, Maris said. "Tuesdays when you're available." They shook hands in the kitchen, and Patrice left, and Maris stood at the window and watched the diner owner's car back out of the drive and thought about what $2.70 times 2 dozen meant against the coffee can balance. The coffee can held $47.30. It was not enough. It would not be enough for a long time, but it was more than $43, and the direction of travel mattered. She started keeping her own notebook in February. Not her father's style of record. He had kept financial records, planting records, equipment maintenance logs, but a different kind. She wrote down the daily egg count in the left margin. In the main body of the page, she wrote down observations. Which birds were most productive? Which ones seemed to feel the cold the most despite the breed's reputation? What the feed consumption was per bird per day versus what she was getting in return? What the water temperature in the coop ran on the worst mornings? Whether the ventilation adjustment she'd made to the south wall had helped with the condensation problem she'd noticed in mid-January. She was not a scientist. She had not studied poultry in any formal sense. What she was doing was paying attention, which is a thing her grandmother had told her once was the most undervalued skill in farming. "People want the knowledge," her grandmother had said, at the kitchen table shelling peas. "They want someone to hand them the answer, but the answer's always been there. You just have to look at the thing long enough to see it." She'd been 12 and had only partially understood what that meant. She understood it better now. What she was seeing in the records was that the birds from the back of the lot, 3 particular hens that had been the thinnest and most featherless at the auction, were now producing as well as the others, sometimes better. She'd named them, which she hadn't intended to do, but which had happened anyway the way things happen when you spend enough time alone with a particular group of animals. The one with the slightly crooked tail feather she called 43, after the dollar amount. The smallest of the three she called Ruth because Ruth Hensley was small and consistently showed up regardless of conditions. The third one she didn't name for a while because she was still a little superstitious about attaching to the birds too much before she was certain they were going to be all right. She named her February because February was the month that told you whether the winter was going to break you or let you through. Earl Denton came back in the first week of February. She was outside when he arrived, stacking the empty feed sacks for recycling. Some of them she was using as additional insulation behind the coop walls, stuffed between the outer siding and the straw bales, which was an ugly solution, but an effective one. She heard the truck and kept stacking because the sacks were not going to stack themselves, and she had learned that stopping what you're doing when Earl Denton arrived only communicated things she didn't want to communicate. He got out of the truck and came to stand a few feet away from her and waited for her to finish the stack. "Heard you've been selling eggs," he said. She said. She picked up the last bag. "To Patrice Odom, among others." He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating in the way she'd seen him do before. When one approach didn't land where he'd expected it, he didn't abandon the conversation, he just relocated to a different entrance. "Maris," he said, "I want you to know that my offer stands. It will stand through the end of February. After that, the bank situation with your loan becomes..." He paused. "More complicated." "You said January was the deadline," she said, "for the full quarter payment." "I said the bank would want it. The bank also has the ability to negotiate terms if there's a credible path to..." "How much did you tell them?" she said. He stopped. "About my operation," she said. "How much did you tell them about what I'm producing? Because you know Calvin Henderson, and Calvin knows what I'm supplying to the cafeteria contract, and you sit on the advisory board, and I have to wonder..." She stopped herself because the sentence was going somewhere she hadn't planned to take it, and she needed to be careful. "I have to wonder who at the bank has been getting a picture of this farm that isn't accurate." Earl Denton looked at her with an expression that was very composed. "I share relevant information with the board," he said. "That's my function." "Relevant to what?" she said. "To the farm's viability or to your interest in acquiring it?" The silence that followed was not comfortable. She had not expected it to be. She had not said the thing to make him comfortable. She had said it because it had been sitting in her chest for weeks, this particular shape of suspicion that she hadn't wanted to voice until she had enough ground under her feet to voice it from. "You're making a serious accusation," he said, and his voice had changed. The avuncular quality was gone. What was underneath it was colder. "I'm asking a question," she said. "You can answer it or not." He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the coop. Then he looked back at her. "The offer expires end of February," he said, and walked back to his truck. She watched him drive out, and her hands were not shaking, which she considered a small personal victory because they had wanted to. She went back to the coop and checked the water and the feeders and counted the morning's eggs, which were 14, and she stood in the warmth of 29 living bodies and breathed. 14 eggs. $2.70 a dozen to Patrice, $2.60 a dozen to Calvin's cafeteria account, $2.50 a dozen to Ruth and anyone else who came to the kitchen door with a carton. The bank payment in January had been late by 6 days. She'd called and spoken to a loan officer named Garrett, who was professionally neutral in the way that people are professionally neutral when they're following someone else's instructions about how to handle a particular account. She'd made the payment. She had the receipt in the kitchen drawer. She had until April for the next one. She did the math again because she always did the math again. It was close. It was too close. But it was closer than it had been in October, and in October she'd been standing in an auction yard being laughed at, and now she was standing in a coop with 14 eggs in a basket and 3 customers and the beginning, just the beginning, of something that might hold. Outside, the wind was working against the walls, and the walls held, and inside the straw and the body heat and the small accumulated warmth of a lot of morning's work kept the temperature at 38 degrees. Which was cold by any standard except the standard that mattered, which was whether the birds were laying. They were laying. February was a long month. She'd always known that. But she'd also learned, from 31 years of living in a place where February came every single year without exception, that the length of February was the point. The length of it was what separated the things that would last from the things that wouldn't. She picked up her basket and latched the coop door and walked back to the house through a cold that was still serious and a wind that was still mean and a sky that was still the flat, indifferent gray of a winter that hadn't finished with anyone yet. And she thought about her grandmother sitting at the kitchen table saying, "The answer's always been there. You just have to look at the thing long enough to see it." And she thought that maybe what the old woman had meant was not just about farming. Maybe she'd meant that the thing you're looking for has been there the whole time. In the birds, in the knowledge passed down through kitchens and almanacs and women who sat shelling peas and talking to 12-year-olds who were only half listening but listening enough. She went inside and put the eggs on the counter and opened the notebook to February's page and wrote down the number. 14. Then she put the kettle on because it was early still and the day was long and there was more of it left to get through. And that was exactly what she planned to do. The 14th of February brought 18 eggs and the first knock at the door that Maris hadn't been expecting. She was in the middle of recording the morning count in her notebook when she heard it. 3 knocks, deliberate, the kind that come from someone who has thought about knocking before they did it. She put the pencil down and went to the door and opened it to find Harlan Pruitt standing on her porch. Harlan Pruitt, who had stood at the auction in October and said, "Those are dead breeds," walking loud enough for half the yard to hear him. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been doing hard work since before the rest of him was fully formed. He ran the largest egg operation in the county, or had run it, which was apparently no longer exactly true, because he was standing on her porch in the middle of February with his hat in his actual hand, not figuratively, but literally held against his chest in the way that older men hold hats when they are trying to communicate that they understand the situation they're in. "Maris," he said. "Harlan," she said. He looked past her into the kitchen for a moment, not rudely, just the way people look when they are trying to figure out how a conversation is going to go, and the kitchen is safer to look at than the person they've come to see. "My operation's been down since the 3rd week of January," he said, "completely. 412 birds and not 1 egg since January 19th. She waited. "I've got contracts," he said. 3 grocery accounts in Mill Haven and a restaurant supply agreement that goes through April. I've been stalling for 3 weeks, and I'm out of ways to stall." "What breed are you running?" she said, because she already knew, but asking it was the right thing to do. "White Leghorns," he said. "Good producers." "In good weather," she said, and this time she didn't stop herself. He took that without flinching, which told her something about how bad the 3 weeks had been. "In good weather," he agreed. She opened the door wider, coming out of the cold. He sat at her kitchen table, her grandmother's kitchen table, the same one she'd sat across from her grandmother at, the same one she'd sat alone at for 14 months doing math that didn't work. And she poured him coffee because it was there and it was February and there was no reason not to. And she sat down across from him with her notebook open between them. "Tell me what you need," she said. What he needed was more than she could supply, and they both knew it before he finished talking. 412 birds going into their 4th week of zero production was a catastrophe of a scale that 29 hens could not address. But he wasn't here for a solution that matched the size of the problem. He was here for whatever she actually had. "I can give you 3 dozen a week right now," she said. "Maybe 4 dozen by the end of the month if the production curve holds where it's been going." He did the math the way farmers do math, fast and quiet, behind the eyes. "That covers 1 grocery account. Barely." "That's what I have," she said. "What are you getting per dozen?" She told him. He didn't blink at the number, which meant either he'd already heard from Calvin or Patrice, or the number was low enough that he didn't have room to negotiate and knew it. "I can do 280, he said. 270, she said. "Same as everyone else." He looked at her. "You're charging everyone the same price?" "I'm charging what the egg is worth," she said, "not what the shortage is worth." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not how business works, Maris." "Maybe not," she said, "but it's how I'm working it." She didn't say it to be righteous. She said it because it was a decision she had made sometime in the 3rd week of January, when she'd started to understand that the shortage was real and spreading and that she had something people needed, and she'd lain awake one night doing the version of the math that calculated how much she could extract from the situation versus how much she needed to keep the operation running and pay toward the bank debt, and she'd arrived at a number that was honest and stayed there. Part of it was practical. She needed repeat customers more than she needed one big score. Part of it was something else, something her grandmother's kitchen table seemed to insist on, a quality of fair dealing that she associated with everything her grandmother had built and maintained and passed on. She didn't examine it too carefully, she just kept the price where it was. Harlan Pruitt nodded slowly. 3 dozen a week, he said, starting this Friday. Starting this Friday, she confirmed, and wrote it in the notebook. He finished his coffee and stood up and put his hat back on, and at the door he stopped and turned around with the expression of a man who has been holding something in his mouth for a while and has decided to say it. "I was wrong at the auction," he said, "about the birds." "You didn't know," she said. "I thought I knew," he said. "That's different." She held the door and watched him walk to his truck, and she thought that might be the most honest thing she'd heard from a man in this county since her father died. By the 3rd week of February, the coffee can held $211, which was more money than it had held since she'd moved back to the farm after her father's funeral. She'd switched from the coffee can to a proper envelope system by then, labeled envelopes in the kitchen drawer, each one marked in her own handwriting. Bank April, Feed March, Repairs, Emergency. The emergency envelope had $12 in it, which was not a real emergency fund by any definition, but it existed, which was more than it had before. The production had climbed to 17 eggs a day on average. On the best days, 19. The birds had surprised her, not in the way that hope surprises you with a sudden flood of better-than-expected results, but in the steady, incremental way of something that had been built right and was performing accordingly. They were not miraculous birds. They got sick occasionally. One hen in early February had developed a respiratory issue that Maris had treated with the same animal vet supplies she used for the goats she no longer had, following instructions from a poultry health bulletin she'd found in the county extension office's public file cabinet, the kind of file cabinet that exists in every county extension office in the country, full of mimeographed sheets that nobody reads anymore until they need them. The hen recovered in 10 days. The others stayed healthy. She was also managing the math more carefully than she had in January, because February had taught her that the difference between barely working and actually working was in the details she'd been loose about. She'd been undercharging for mileage on deliveries. Not much, a few cents per trip, but it added up over a month in a way that surprised her when she finally sat down and calculated it. She adjusted. She started tracking feed costs per bird per week against eggs per bird per week, which was a calculation she hadn't been making precisely enough. And the result told her that 3 of her birds were eating at a rate that didn't justify their production, and that she needed to either supplement their diet differently or make a harder decision about the flock composition in the spring. She wrote all of this in the notebook, not because anyone would ever read it, but because writing it made her think about it more carefully, which was the whole point. Well, the knock she hadn't expected came on a Saturday morning in the last week of February, and this time it wasn't one person. It was 4. She opened the door to find a small cluster of people she recognized arranged on her porch in the way that groups arrange themselves when they've arrived together, but nobody wants to be the first one to speak. There was Della Marsh, who ran the feed co-op with her husband. There was Tom Birch, whose family had farmed the Ridge property 3 miles north for 2 generations. There was a woman Maris didn't know well, younger, maybe mid-20s, with a child on her hip and the specific exhaustion around her eyes of a person who has been managing a hard situation for too long. And there was Calvin Henderson, who had apparently decided to come back despite the fact that their business arrangement was already settled, which meant he was here for something else. "Morning," Maris said. "Morning," Calvin said, which appeared to be his designated role in this particular assembly. "We were wondering if we could talk to you for a few minutes." She looked at the group, at the child on the young woman's hip, at Della Marsh, who was looking at her boots, at Tom Birch, who was looking at Maris directly in the way of a man who has decided to be straightforward and is committed to it. "Come in," she said. They filled her kitchen in a way it hadn't been filled since her father's funeral reception, when neighbors had brought food and stood in corners and talked around the fact of his absence. She put the kettle on because it gave her hands something to do, and because standing in her own kitchen while people arranged themselves around her table felt strange in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not unwelcome exactly, but unfamiliar in a way that required a moment. Tom Birch spoke first. There are 6 families in the township that are having a hard time right now, he said. Egg supplies from the usual sources are gone, or nearly gone, and what's available from Millhaven is priced at a level that he stopped and recalibrated. It's too high for families that are already stretched. Maris looked at the young woman with the child. What's your situation? She said. The woman looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. I've got 4 kids, she said. My husband's working in Millhaven right now, staying with his brother during the week because the roads are too bad. I've been buying eggs when I can get them, but the store in town has been out for 2 weeks, and the price when they have them... She stopped. I'm sorry, I don't even know you. I came with Calvin because he said you might... Don't apologize, Maris said. What's your name? Lena Taft. How many dozen a week do you need, Lena? I can't afford... I didn't ask what you could afford, Maris said, not unkindly. I asked what you need. Lena looked at Calvin, who looked at Maris. 2 dozen, Lena said quietly. For 4 kids, and 2 dozen. Maris wrote it down. Then she looked at Della Marsh. Della, what's the co-op situation? Della finally looked up. She was a practical woman, not given to sentiment, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been doing practical calculations for a week and hasn't liked the results. We've had 3 families come to the co-op asking if we carry eggs. We don't, never have. That's not what we do. But they came because they're out of other options. She paused. I told them I'd ask around. Which families? Della named them. Maris wrote them down. Tom Birch said, There's also the Whitmore family up on the ridge. Old couple, both in their 70s. Their son usually brings supplies, but the road up to their place has been impassable for 3 weeks. I know that road, Maris said. My father used to take the tractor up there. Your father did a lot of things, Tom said, and there was something in how he said it that was not just a statement of fact. She looked at him. He was a good neighbor, Tom said. That's all I meant. She looked back at her notebook. She had 17 eggs a day, averaging across the past 2 weeks. She had Harlan Pruitt's order, Calvin's cafeteria order, Patrice's diner order, Ruth Hensley's standing dozen. All of that was committed production. What was left over, if she calculated correctly, was somewhere between 2 and 4 dozen a week, depending on the day. 2 to 4 dozen spread across 6 families in need was not enough. She knew that before she finished the calculation. But she also knew that her birds were still trending upward. Not dramatically, but consistently, and that what she had today was not necessarily what she would have in 3 weeks. She said, I can't fill everything you've just described. Not right now. Nobody looked surprised. They had come expecting a partial answer, she realized. They had come because a partial answer was better than no answer, and they were people who had learned the same lesson she'd been learning all winter, which was that you work with what actually exists, not with what you wish existed. Here's what I can do, she said. Lena, you get 2 dozen a week at cost. That's what I pay for the feed and the supplies, divided by production. I'll work out the number and tell you what that is. It's less than what I charge the diner. Lena Taft started to say something and Maris held up one finger, not to silence her, but to finish the sentence first. The Whitmore family gets a delivery once a week with whatever I can spare, and I'll take the tractor up that road myself because I know it. The other 4 families, Della, can you coordinate? I can, Della said. They get what's left after the standing orders are filled. First come, first served, 1 dozen per family per week. The price is the same price I'm charging everyone else. She looked around the table. I'm not running a charity. I need this operation to stay solvent or it helps nobody. But I'm not going to charge more because people are desperate. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That's fair, Tom Birch said. And then, because he was apparently a man who followed through on things, what do you need from us? The question caught her off guard. She'd expected the conversation to be about what she could give, not about what she needed in return, and the shift in it opened something she hadn't prepared for. I need the road to the Whitmore place cleared enough for a tractor, she said, even just once. I can do that, Tom said. My nephew has a blade on his truck. We'll get it passable by Wednesday. I need someone who can deliver to the families on the south end of the township, because I can't drive everywhere and manage the flock at the same time. I drive south 3 times a week, Della said. I can take deliveries. And I need—" She stopped. She had been about to say she didn't need anything else because that was her default, the reflex of someone who had been operating alone for 14 months and had constructed her entire daily life around not needing things she didn't have. But she stopped and thought about it honestly for a moment. "I need a second water bucket for the coop. Mine cracked last week. I've been managing with one." Calvin Henderson said, "I've got 3 extras in my barn. I'll drop one off today." She wrote it all down in the notebook, not because she couldn't remember it, but because writing it made it real, and making things real was something she had decided to do as consistently as possible. The second to last week of February brought a development she had not anticipated, and it came through Patrice Odom, who called on the diner's landline on a Tuesday afternoon while Maris was in the equipment shed running a maintenance check on the bandsaw. She almost didn't answer. She'd been in the middle of something. She answered because she'd learned that not answering was a habit she couldn't afford. "I had a man in the diner this morning," Patrice said, without preamble, which was how Patrice communicated when she had something to say. "From the Millhaven Agricultural Cooperative. He was asking around about egg supply in the county. They're trying to source locally because their usual suppliers are down." "How far down?" Maris said. "Most of the county east of Millhaven, from what he was saying. The cooperatives that supply the city markets are operating at maybe 30% capacity. The grocery stores are limiting purchases." Patrice paused. "He asked me where I was getting eggs. I told him." Maris was quiet for a moment. "You told him about me." "I told him there was one reliable source of fresh eggs in this county, and that it was a farm 8 miles east of Carver's Crossing. Whether you want to talk to the man is your business, but he's coming back to the diner Thursday morning." She stood in the equipment shed with the phone in her hand and looked at the bandsaw she'd been checking and thought about what a conversation with someone from the Millhaven Agricultural Cooperative would mean, practically speaking. She was currently producing 17 to 19 eggs a day. A cooperative relationship would mean commitments she might not be able to keep if production fluctuated, and production always fluctuated, but it would also mean a larger market. And a larger market for the bird she currently had meant revenue that the coffee can, the envelope system, couldn't generate from local sales alone. "What's his name?" she said. "Gerald Foss," Patrice said. "He seemed straightforward. Older fellow, not a salesman type." "Thursday morning," Maris said. 8 o'clock if you want to meet him there." She wrote Gerald Foss in the notebook, and Thursday 8 a.m., and then sat with it for a while, looking at the page. The thing about opportunities that arrive when you're not ready for them is that they rarely wait for you to become ready. She had learned that from the auction in October. Not that she'd been ready that day either, but that the day had existed regardless of her readiness, and the choice had been whether to act or not. She'd acted. She was still acting on it every morning at 4:30, every time she went out in temperatures that had been below zero twice in January, every time she filled the feeders and checked the water and wrote the number in the notebook. 17 eggs. 19 eggs. 14 on the days the wind was worst. But always eggs. 10. She met Gerald Foss on Thursday at 8 in the morning at the diner, where Patrice served them both coffee and eggs, her eggs, which felt like a quiet statement that Maris appreciated, and left them to talk at the corner table. Gerald Foss was in his late 60s, with a gray beard trimmed short and the kind of calm that comes from having been in a lot of rooms with a lot of people over a long career. He didn't sell. He asked questions, listened to the answers, and then asked more questions. She respected that. "What's your flock size?" he said. 29. He wrote it down. "Current production?" "Averaging 17 to 19 a day. Best week was 21 a day." "And you've maintained that through the freeze?" "Through the entire freeze," she said. "We've had 2 days below zero. Production dropped to 13 both times and was back to 17 the next morning." He looked at what he'd written. "What breed?" "Chanticleer." He looked up. "Genuine Chanticleer? Not a cross?" "Purebred, estate sale lot. The previous owner's records came with them. I got the paperwork in the crate without knowing it at first." She'd found the folded papers 3 days after the auction, tucked under the crate liner. Breeding records going back 4 years, handwritten, showing a closed flock that had been maintained with unusual care by someone who apparently hadn't told anyone else what they were doing. 5 generations of documented cold climate selection. Gerald set down his pen. Do you know what that's worth to the cooperative? I'm starting to understand it, she said. There are people in this city, in 3 cities, who cannot get fresh eggs right now. Not from the usual sources. The commercial operations that supply the grocery chains are down across the board. The breeds they run aren't built for a winter like this one. He picked up his pen again. A documented cold climate laying flock that has maintained production through the worst freeze in 11 years is not just an egg supply. It's a breeding resource. She sat with that for a moment. I'm not selling the flock, she said. I'm not asking you to, he said. I'm asking if you'd consider a supply agreement, and separately whether you'd be interested in discussing breeding stock pricing for spring. The breakfast dishes were in front of them, and she hadn't touched the eggs yet, which was something she noticed only because it was her eggs, scrambled properly by Patrice, who knew how to cook them, and she'd been too focused on the conversation to eat. She picked up the fork. Tell me what a supply agreement looks like, she said. He told her. It was more complicated than what she'd been doing with Calvin and Patrice and the others. Volume commitments, pricing structures indexed to production, a minimum order threshold that she was currently below but could realistically reach by March if the trend held. There were parts of it she didn't understand well enough to agree to on the spot, and she said so, which he seemed to find either acceptable or refreshing. She couldn't tell which. I'll need to read anything written before I sign it, she said, and I'll need a week. A week is fine, he said. We're not going anywhere. She drove home with the conversation running through her head on a loop, the way important conversations do when you haven't had time to process them yet. She ran the numbers as she drove, keeping them in her head rather than writing them down, because she couldn't write and drive on winter roads. The numbers she came to were not certain numbers. They were possibility numbers, the kind that depend on variables she couldn't fully control. But even the conservative version of the numbers, even the version where she discounted every projection by 30%, the way her father had taught her to discount projections, produced a monthly income that would cover the bank payment and the feed cost, and leave something over for the emergency envelope. Not a lot, but something that was real. She pulled into the farm drive and sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. The coop was visible from here, the new boards visible at the base where she'd replaced the rotted sections, the straw bales stacked against the walls in a way that was functional rather than pretty. From the truck she could hear nothing, but she knew the birds were in there, and she knew what they were doing because they were always doing the same thing at this time of day. She thought about Earl Denton's offer. End of February, he'd said. She had 5 days. She thought about the coffee can, the envelope system, the 211 in the bank envelope and the 12 in the emergency envelope, and the number that Gerald Foss had put on the table at the diner. She thought about her grandmother saying the answer's always been there. You just have to look at the thing long enough to see it. And she thought that maybe the answer had been in those breeding records folded under the crate liner, and in the extension bulletins in the county file cabinet, and in the memory of a 12-year-old half listening at a kitchen table, and that looking at the thing long enough had been 14 months of not giving up and getting up at 4:30 and doing the math again every time the math scared her. She got out of the truck and went to the coop and opened the door and stood in the warmth. 19 eggs in the nest boxes. She counted them twice because she always counted them twice, and the number was the same both times, and she put them in the basket and latched the door and walked back to the house in the last of the afternoon light, with the cold working at her face and her hands and the dry sound of her boots on the frozen ground. 5 days until Earl Denton's offer expired. She had no intention of taking it, but she had every intention of making sure, by the time those 5 days were up, that the reason she didn't take it was written in numbers he couldn't argue with, in a notebook that had started as something she did to pay attention and had become, without her quite planning it, the record of a farm that was not dying anymore. She went inside and put the eggs on the counter and opened the notebook to a fresh page and started writing. The 5 days passed without a word from Earl Denton, which she had not expected. She had expected another truck in the drive, another composed expression, another restatement of the offer, maybe a new number attached to it, something to indicate that he had been watching the situation develop and had recalculated. What she got instead was silence, and silence from Earl Denton felt different from silence from anyone else. It had a quality to it, a waiting quality. The kind that comes from a person who has decided to let something play out rather than intervene in it, because they've concluded that playing out is going to produce the result they wanted anyway. She didn't trust the silence, but she worked inside it. The cooperative agreement from Gerald Foss arrived in her mailbox on a Tuesday, 8 pages printed on both sides, with a cover letter that was professional and clear and didn't oversell anything, which she appreciated. She read it twice at the kitchen table, once quickly to get the shape of it, and once slowly with a pencil, marking the sections she didn't understand or didn't agree with. There were 4 sections she marked. She called Gerald Foss on the phone number in the letter and told him what they were. He explained 2 of them to her satisfaction. On the third, a clause about exclusivity of supply that would have prevented her from selling to local customers like Patrice and Calvin and Lena Taft. She said no, plainly, and explained why. There was a pause on his end. The cooperative's position on exclusivity is standard, he said. I understand that, she said, but I have commitments to people in this township that I made before you and I met, and those commitments stand. If the cooperative can't work around that, we don't have a deal. Another pause. She waited it out. I'll take it back to the board, he said. Give me 48 hours. The 4th marked section was about delivery logistics. The agreement assumed she had refrigerated transport, which she did not. Gerald Foss had apparently not considered this, or had assumed it and not verified it, which was the kind of detail that separated a plan from a working plan. She told him about it while he was still on the phone. What do you have? He said. A 1987 Ford pickup and a cooler, she said. There was a pause that she was fairly certain contained something close to a laugh, though Gerald Foss was too professional to let it fully materialize. We can arrange pickup from your end, he said. Our driver comes through Carver's Crossing twice a week. We can add your farm to the route. Then add it, she said. She hung up and sat at the table for a while, looking at the agreement with its pencil marks, and thought about the version of herself that had stood at that auction in October with $43 and a very specific piece of knowledge, and no idea whether the knowledge was going to be enough. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph was something she associated with finished things, and nothing here was finished. But she felt something more durable than triumph. The particular solidity of a person who has been tested by something real and has discovered incrementally and without ceremony that they are harder than the thing testing them. Gerald Foss called back in 36 hours, not 48. The exclusivity clause was removed. The delivery logistics were amended. The minimum volume threshold was adjusted to reflect current production rather than projected production, with a step-up structure built in that would increase her commitment as supply increased. It was not a perfect agreement. No agreement is, but it was workable, which was the thing that mattered. She signed it on a Thursday morning at the kitchen table with the same pen she used for the notebook, and she put the signed copy in an envelope and drove it to the post office in Carver's Crossing, where Ruth Hensley was behind the counter, and noticed the cooperative letterhead on the envelope before Maris got it across the counter. Millhaven Agricultural Cooperative, Ruth said, reading upside down with the practiced ease of a person who has processed other people's mail for 30 years. Don't, Maris said, but she was almost smiling when she said it. I didn't say a word, Ruth said, and stamped the envelope with an expression of complete innocence. The first cooperative pickup happened the following Monday. A truck came at 7 in the morning, an actual refrigerated panel truck, cleaner than anything Maris drove, with the cooperative's logo on the side, and a driver named Pete, who was in his 40s and spoke mostly in single syllables, and moved the egg cases with the efficient disinterest of someone who had been loading and unloading things for a long time. He signed her copy of the pickup receipt and handed it back without ceremony, and that was the whole transaction. She stood in the drive and watched the truck go and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was the particular calm of watching something she'd built go out into the world and function. It lasted about 4 minutes, and then she went back inside because it was cold and there was work to do. March arrived with a moderation that the county received with the exhausted gratitude of people who have been enduring something for too long. It didn't warm up. Not really, not in the way that spring eventually arrives. But the worst edge came off the cold, and the temperature began to stay above single digits during the days. and the particular quality of the light changed in a way that was more about promise than delivery, but was still something after the long gray weeks of January and February. The birds responded to it the way Maris had read they would, the way her grandmother's notes had suggested they would, the way her own records now confirmed. Production didn't drop as the temperature moderated, it increased. The strain that had been directing energy toward cold management had more to work with now, and what they did with that extra resource was lay eggs with a consistency that made Maris update her notebook projections twice in the first 2 weeks of March, and then stop projecting and just record the actuals, because the actuals were running ahead of anything she'd written down. 22 eggs a day in the first week of March, 24 in the second. On a Thursday that she remembered specifically because the sun came out for the first time in what felt like months, and the farm looked different in it. The same farm, the same winter-beaten structures, but lit differently, shadows going in the right direction again. She collected 26 eggs in a single morning, which was a number she had not allowed herself to project because projecting it had felt like something that would jinx it. She wrote it in the notebook and underlined it, which was something she did not usually do. It was in the second week of March that the loan officer called. Not Garrett, the professionally neutral one. This was a different voice, a woman, who introduced herself as Sandra Elliott and said she was calling from the First Agricultural Bank of Carver's Crossing regarding the Holloway farm account. Maris sat down. "I've been reviewing your account," Sandra Elliott said. "Your April payment is coming up." "I'm aware," Maris said. "You made your January payment 6 days late," the woman said, "and your October payment was partial." "The October payment was partial because I was in the middle of restructuring the operations revenue base," Maris said. "The balance was paid in November. Both things are in the account record." "They are," Sandra Elliott said, and her tone shifted slightly in a way Maris was trying to read over the phone. "Ms. Holloway, I want to be transparent with you. There has been some discussion at the advisory board level about the status of this account." Maris's hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of discussion?" "The kind that happens when an account has had a regular payment history and the property is flagged as, and I'm quoting from internal notes here, potentially non-viable as an ongoing agricultural enterprise." "Who flagged it?" A pause. "That's not information I'm able to share." "I see," Maris said. She did see. The picture was clear enough. Earl Denton on the advisory board, Earl Denton who had wanted the farm for 14 months, Earl Denton who had come twice to offer fair market value and had been turned down twice, and who had the kind of access to institutional processes that men in his position have when they've spent 20 years making sure they were in the room where certain decisions got made. "Ms. Elliott," she said, "I'm going to ask you to look at the account again, specifically at the payment activity since February 1st. Another pause. She could hear the sound of a keyboard. "I see 2 payments in February," the woman said, "and 1 in early March." "What's the total of those 3 payments?" the woman told her. "That's more than the scheduled quarterly amount," Maris said. "I've been making payments ahead of schedule since February. I have a supply agreement with the Millhaven Agricultural Cooperative that I signed 3 weeks ago. I have standing accounts with 4 local businesses and a documented customer base in this township. I can send you the cooperative agreement, the notebook production records going back to November, and the signed purchase receipts from every sale I've made since October." The silence on the other end was a different quality of silence from Earl Denton's silence. This one had uncertainty in it. The uncertainty of a person who has been given a picture of a situation and is now discovering that the picture was incomplete. "That would be helpful," Sandra Elliott said. "If you could send that documentation to my attention, I'll have it in your mailbox by Friday," Maris said. She hung up and sat very still at the kitchen table for about 30 seconds. Then she got up and went to the equipment shed and found the old document boxes her father had kept financial records in, and she brought them inside, and she spent the rest of the afternoon and most of the evening building the clearest picture she could of what the Holloway farm had been doing since October, in numbers and receipts and signed agreements, organized in a way that told a story she was prepared to stand behind. It was almost midnight when she finished. She made a list of what was in the package and sealed it and addressed it to Sandra Elliott at the First Agricultural Bank of Carver's Crossing, and she set it by the door for the morning. Then she went to bed, and she slept better than she had in 2 weeks, not because the problem was solved, but because she had done everything she could do about it, which is the only condition under which certain kinds of people can sleep at all. The response from the bank came 10 days later in a letter that was formal and careful in the way that institutional letters are when the institution is in the middle of correcting a course without admitting that correction was necessary. Sandra Elliott wrote that the account had been reviewed and that the documentation provided was sufficient to demonstrate the farm's viability as an ongoing agricultural enterprise, that the flagging notation had been removed from the account, and that provided the April payment was made on schedule, no further action regarding account status was contemplated at this time. Maris read it 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer with the other documents that mattered, behind the October auction receipt, and the signed cooperative agreement and the payment receipts from January and February and March. She did not feel like celebrating. She felt like the letter was what should have been true all along, which was different. What she felt, more precisely, was that a thing which had been trying to happen to her, a thing that had been arranged, or at least enabled, by someone who had access to the arrangements, had not happened, and that the reason it had not happened was that she had built something real enough to push back against it. She thought about Earl Denton. She had not spoken to him since the February evening when he'd stated his offer's expiration and walked to his truck. She did not know what he had said to the advisory board, or when, or exactly how much of it had been deliberate versus opportunistic. She was not certain enough to call it what she privately called it, not out loud, not to anyone. What she knew was what she had, and what she had was enough. What? Calvin Henderson came by on a Saturday in mid-March, and this time he came without a purpose, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. He leaned against the fence by the coop while she was doing the midday check, and he talked about the weather and the road conditions and the state of his own operation, which was beginning to recover as the temperatures came up. His leghorns were starting to lay again tentatively, in the way that breeds accustomed to comfort resume normal function once the comfort returns. Mine never stopped, Maris said, not to score a point, just because it was true, and he was the kind of person who could hear true things without it becoming a wound. I know, he said. I've been thinking about that. She looked at him. About what I said at the auction. Before the auction, I mean. I've said things like that a lot over the years. About certain approaches, certain breeds, certain ways of doing things that weren't the standard way. He paused. I don't know that I was ever right in a way that mattered. This was a longer version of the apology he'd started to give in the coop back in October, the one she'd deflected. She let him finish it this time. I think I've been farming the way I was taught, he said, without asking whether what I was taught was the best way or just the way that was convenient to teach. She thought about her grandmother's extension bulletins, about the mimeographed sheets in the county file cabinet that nobody read until they needed them, about a 12-year-old sitting at a kitchen table only half listening and the things that had been stored in that half listening that had turned out to be the most important things she knew. It's not your fault, she said. Most people farm the way they're taught. My father did too. But you didn't, Calvin said. I didn't have his operation to maintain, she said. I had to start over from the bottom, which meant I had nothing to protect. When you've got nothing to protect, you can afford to try the thing that sounds wrong. He considered that. That's either wisdom or rationalization. Probably both, she said. He left shortly after, and she went back to the coop and stood in it for a moment in the particular way she sometimes stood in it when she needed to think. Not doing anything, just being inside the warmth and the noise of 29 birds going about their business, which had become in some way she hadn't anticipated the most stabilizing thing in her day. The Taft delivery happened every Tuesday, and by March it had become a routine that had its own small texture. Lena Taft usually had one of the kids with her when she came to pick up. Not always the same one, but always one, usually the youngest, a boy about 3 years old who regarded Maris with the serious, evaluating look of a small child who is trying to categorize a new adult into the system he has developed for understanding the world. One Tuesday in the 3rd week of March, Lena Taft arrived with all 4 kids, which was unusual, and the oldest one, a girl maybe 9 or 10, was carrying a hand-drawn card. It was her idea, Lena said, with the slightly embarrassed tone of a parent who has decided that the embarrassing thing is going to happen anyway, and there's nothing to do but stand alongside it. The card said "Thank you for the eggs" in large, uneven letters, with a drawing of what was either a chicken or a very small dinosaur below the text. The girl held it out with the solemnity of someone completing an important transaction. Maris took it. She looked at it for a moment. She was not a person who cried easily. She hadn't cried since her father's funeral, not once, and before that not in years. But something in the specific combination of the drawing and the girl's serious expression and the fact of the Tuesday deliveries themselves, which had come from a conversation at her kitchen table on a cold February Saturday that she hadn't planned for, did something to the back of her throat that required a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Emma," the girl said. "I know," Maris said. "Your mom's told me." "She says you kept us in eggs all winter," Emma said. "Your mom's being generous," Maris said. "You kept yourselves in eggs. I just had the birds." Emma looked at her with the expression of a child who is not entirely sure that statement makes logical sense but is prepared to accept it. Maris put the card on the kitchen counter, leaning against the backsplash. She looked at it several times over the next few days while she was washing dishes or making coffee, and she left it there. The Whitmore delivery was a different kind of routine. Tom Birch's nephew had cleared the road in the first week of March, as promised, well enough for a truck to navigate it slowly. Not well, and not safely in bad weather, but passable in the dry, cold days that the second half of February had produced. Maris took the tractor the first time anyway, because she'd said she would, and because she wasn't confident enough in the road to trust the Ford on it yet. Gordon and Alice Whitmore were in their mid-70s, and they received her arrival the first time with the particular combination of pride and relief that older people sometimes display when they have been managing on reserves they weren't sure they had, and help arrives before the reserves fully run out. Gordon Whitmore came to the door with a dog at his knee, a big old shepherd mix that regarded Maris with calm assessment, and looked at the egg basket she was carrying and said, "How much do we owe you?" "Half what I charge everyone else," she said. "I won't accept charity," he said. Not rudely, not with heat, just as a statement of fact about who he was. "I'm not offering charity," she said. "I'm adjusting for the road condition. You're harder to reach than my other customers, and I can't always guarantee I'll get up here, so I discount for the uncertainty." He looked at her. She could tell he knew this was not exactly the actual reason. She could also tell he was willing to accept the framing because it gave him a way to take the help without feeling the help. "Half price?" he said. "Half price," she confirmed. Alice Whitmore appeared behind her husband with a ceramic dish covered in a kitchen towel and held it out. "Bread?" she said. "Whole wheat. I baked this morning." Maris took the dish, and she drove back down the ridge road with the bread on the seat beside her and the empty basket on the floor, and thought about the economy of a thing. How food moves between people who grow or make things, how it had always moved that way before the systems that now distributed it had made that movement invisible, and how the invisibility of it made its return in moments like this one feel like something recovered rather than something new. Map. The notebook was 43 pages by the end of March. She had not planned for it to be that long. It had started as a practical tool, egg counts, feed calculations, customer accounts, and it had accumulated into something more, the way records do when you keep them faithfully over time. She could open it to any week since November and read back what was happening, not just in the production numbers, but in the texture of the days. The morning she'd repaired the ventilation cover in the dark with frozen fingers. The afternoon Calvin Henderson had come to the fence looking embarrassed. The Tuesday she'd sat across from Gerald Foss eating her own eggs and signing the cooperative agreement in her head before she'd signed it on paper. She turned to the April page on the first of the month and wrote the date and the egg count, 24, which was the new average, the number the birds had stabilized at as the weather moderated. And below it, she wrote a number that she had been calculating for several days and had been waiting to make official by writing it down. The number was the total she needed for the April bank payment, subtracted from the total in the envelope marked Bank April in the kitchen drawer. The result was a positive number. Not a large positive number, not the kind of number that suggests comfort or margin or the ability to absorb a setback, but positive, which meant the payment was covered. which meant April was manageable, which was something she had not been able to say with certainty about any month since her father's funeral. She wrote it down. She looked at it. She did not perform any particular emotion about it. Then she turned to a new page and started a list of what needed to happen in April, the repairs that winter had revealed, the feed adjustments for the warming weather, the conversation she needed to have with Gerald Foss about the step-up clause in the cooperative agreement, the question of whether she was going to expand the flock, and how she would do it if she decided to, the Whitmore Road situation in mud season, the band saw that needed a new blade. The list was long. She started at the top. Fun. Harlan Pruitt called on a Wednesday evening in the second week of April and got her while she was doing the evening co-op check, which meant she had the phone tucked between her ear and her shoulder, and she was checking water levels at the same time, which she could do now without thinking about it. The way you stop thinking about things that have become part of the body's routine. "My operation's coming back," he said. "Slowly. I'll have eggs by May, maybe late April if I'm lucky." "Good," she said. She meant it. "I'm going to lose the grocery accounts in Millhaven," he said. "They found other suppliers during the winter. I was too long out of commission." She adjusted the water bucket. "I'm sorry about that." "I'm not calling for sympathy," he said. "I'm calling because I've been thinking about what you did this winter. The pricing. The consistency." A pause. "The fact that you kept local families and eggs at a price they could actually pay." "It was practical," she said. "It was more than practical," he said. "I've been talking to Tom Birch and to Della Marsh, and there's a conversation happening among some of the farmers in this township about a cooperative model, not the Millhaven operation, a local one, smaller, focused on supplying the township itself, direct to consumers, direct to local businesses." She stopped what she was doing. "You'd be the natural anchor," Harlan said. "The only operation in the county that maintained production through the winter, the only documented Chanticleer flock. It would be your choice whether you wanted to be involved, but who else is in the conversation?" she said. He named them. Calvin Henderson, Tom Birch, Della Marsh, a younger farmer named Rick Sato, who had a vegetable operation on the south end of the township that he'd been running for 3 years and who had been selling direct to consumers from a roadside stand. A woman named Carolyn Vance, who kept goats and made cheese and had been looking for a distribution structure for 2 years without finding one that worked. "That's a real group," Maris said. "It's a real conversation," Harlan said. "Whether it becomes a real group depends on who shows up." She thought about the kitchen table. The February Saturday with 4 people in her kitchen and a child on Lena Taft's hip, and a conversation that had produced something more organized than the sum of its parts, because the people in the room had been willing to ask what they could do rather than only what they could get. "Tell them I'll show up," she said. She hung up and finished the water check and collected the evening eggs. 23, which was within the normal range, and latched the coop door and stood outside in the April dark, which was cold, but not the cold of January or February, a transitional cold, the kind that is already carrying the memory of what's coming next. She thought about the farm, about the acres she hadn't planted, about the upper fields that had sat fallow for 2 seasons while she managed the immediate crisis and didn't have the capital or the time to think beyond it, about what the farm might look like in 2 years if the cooperative idea became real, if the Chanticleer breeding stock produced the value Gerald Foss had suggested it could, if the bank stayed satisfied and the operation stayed solvent and she could start thinking forward rather than just holding the line. She was not a person who let herself get too far ahead of the present, because the present had taught her, repeatedly and without apology, that it required her full attention. But standing in the April dark with 23 eggs in a basket and a list in a notebook and an envelope in a drawer that was going to cover the payment due at the end of the month, she allowed herself a moment of something that was not quite hope and not quite confidence, but was the solid thing that exists between them, the thing that comes from having been tested and having held. The farm was still hers. The birds were still laying. The debt was still real, but shrinking in a direction that had a destination. She went inside and put the eggs on the counter and looked at the card from Emma Taft leaning against the backsplash, the chicken that might be a dinosaur, the thank you in large, uneven letters. And she stood there in her grandmother's kitchen at the end of a day that had been exactly as hard as all the other days, and she was exactly as tired as she was every evening, and none of that had changed. But the notebook was 43 pages long, and the April envelope was full. And outside in the coop that her grandmother had built in 1962, 29 birds were settling onto the roost bars she'd reinforced with salvaged lumber in November, generating the warmth that had sustained them through the longest winter anyone in the county could remember. And they would be there in the morning when she got up at 4:30, and so would she. The first cooperative meeting happened on a Thursday evening in the third week of April in the back room of Delamarche's feed co-op, which was the largest indoor space any of them could access without paying for it. Maris arrived 7 minutes early, which was earlier than she'd intended, and found Tom Birch already there moving folding chairs into a rough circle. He'd brought a folding table too, which nobody had asked him to bring, and it was the right thing to have, which was characteristic of Tom Birch in a way she'd come to recognize over the winter. A man who thought about what a situation required before the situation announced it. "How many are we expecting?" she said, picking up a chair and opening it. Harlan said 6 confirmed, maybe 8. 8 people is a committee, she said. Not a cooperative. 8 people who show up, Tom said, is more than 12 who said they might. She set the chair down. He had a point. They came in over the next 20 minutes. Harlan Pruitt, who had organized this more than anyone and arrived with a legal pad and a pen. Calvin Henderson, who brought coffee in a big thermos without being asked, which meant he'd been to enough meetings to know what meetings needed. Rick Sato, the vegetable farmer from the South End, who was younger than Maris had expected from Harlan's description, maybe 28, with the particular alertness of someone who is new to something and is taking notes in their head because they haven't been around long enough to know which things will matter later. Carolyn Vance, who kept goats and made cheese, and came with a folder of papers she'd been carrying since apparently before Harlan had even called the meeting, which suggested she'd been waiting for this conversation for longer than any of them. And 2 people Maris didn't know, a couple named Dale and Francis Okafor, who raised heritage turkeys on a property 12 miles east and had heard about the meeting through Carolyn. 8 people total. The right number for a first meeting, which is a number small enough that everyone talks and large enough that the conversation goes somewhere. Harlan opened it without ceremony because Harlan was not a man for ceremony. "We all know why we're here. The winter showed us something we should have already known, which is that this township's food supply depends entirely on external sources except for whatever we individually produce and sell. And when those external sources fail, which they did, we have no structure for managing together. Maris had something this winter. The rest of us didn't. That's the conversation." He looked at Maris when he said it, not accusingly, but with the directness of a man who has spent a winter being wrong about something and has decided the only productive response to that is to be straightforwardly right about what happens next. "I want to be clear about something," Maris said, because the way Harlan had framed it put her in a position she didn't want to occupy unchallenged. "What I had this winter was a specific breed in a specific coop that I happened to know about because my grandmother kept them on this property 40 years ago. It wasn't a strategy. It was an accident of inheritance that I recognized when I saw it." "You recognized it when nobody else did," Rick Sato said. Not flattering, just observational. He was the kind of young man who said what he saw. "I recognized it because I'd been told about it," she said. "That's the whole point. The knowledge was already here, in this county, in these families, in the extension office files that nobody reads. We don't need to invent anything. We need to stop forgetting what we already know." Carolyn Vance put her folder on the table. "That's exactly what this is about," she said. "I've been making aged goat cheese for 6 years. I have 4 restaurants in Millhaven that would buy it regularly if I could supply them consistently, which I can't do alone because I'm managing everything myself. Rick has vegetables that could go to the same restaurants if he had a way to consolidate shipping. Dale and Francis have heritage turkey that people will pay premium prices for if they can find it." She looked around the table. "The problem isn't production. It's that we're all doing everything separately." "Infrastructure," Dale Okafor said. It was the first word he'd spoken. He said it in the tone of someone who has identified the exact word for a thing and is offering it to the room. "Infrastructure," Carolyn agreed. They talked for 2 hours. The coffee thermos went around twice. Harlan filled 3 pages of his legal pad with notes that nobody asked him to take, but that everyone was relieved were being taken. They argued about governance. Rick Sato wanted a formal charter. Calvin Henderson thought a formal charter was getting ahead of themselves. Maris said they needed something written down, but it didn't have to be complicated, which was a position everyone eventually agreed with, even if they arrived at it from different directions. They argued about money, which was inevitable and necessary. Starting a cooperative requires capital, and capital requires either investment or debt. An investment means shares, and shares mean governance questions they hadn't finished resolving. And debt means terms, and terms means someone has to negotiate them and be accountable for them. It was Carolyn Vance who cut through it by pulling a single page from her folder and setting it on the table. A simple calculation she'd done herself, projecting the combined output of everyone in the room against the wholesale prices currently available at the Millhaven market. And the number at the bottom of the page was large enough that several people were quiet for a moment after looking at it. "That's conservative," Carolyn said. "That's if we each contribute the minimum we've already confirmed we can produce. If we grow into it, the number goes up." "That number requires we have a buyer for everything," Harlan said. "Not just Millhaven. Millhaven's one market." "Gerald Foss," Maris said. Everyone looked at her. "The Millhaven Agricultural Cooperative. I have a contact there. He's been honest with me, and the agreement I have with them has an expansion clause. I can call him and find out if a multi-producer arrangement is something they'd discuss." "You'd be willing to do that," Harlan said. She looked at him. 6 months ago, this man had stood at an auction and said her birds were dead breeds walking. He had said it loud enough for half the yard to hear. And now he was sitting across from her in a folding chair asking whether she was willing to make a phone call on behalf of a cooperative that might include him. "Yes," she said. "I'll call him Monday." She called Gerald Foss on Monday. He was interested. The conversation lasted 40 minutes and ended with him saying he'd need to bring the multi-producer arrangement to the cooperative's board, but that given the winter supply situation and the demonstrated demand from Millhaven markets, he anticipated a positive reception. He said he would come to Carver's Crossing the following month to meet the group. She wrote it all down. She told Harlan. The second meeting was scheduled. May came in green and tentative the way May does in that part of the country. Slow at first, then suddenly everywhere, the trees going from bare to full in what felt like a single week. The fields that had been brown and rigid under snow now showing the first uncertain growth. Maris planted the upper fields in the second week of May. Not all of them. She was not in a position to plant all of them, and she'd learned well enough not to expand faster than her actual capacity could support. She planted 20 acres of the 60 available, a cover crop mix that would build the soil for a cash crop the following year, and a small section she put into a market garden that was experimental and probably optimistic but felt like the right risk to take. She hired help for the planting, which was the first time she'd hired anyone since she'd been running the farm alone. A neighbor boy, 17, strong, not particularly skilled but willing to learn and honest about what he didn't know, which she valued more than false confidence, came for 3 days at $12 an hour. She couldn't afford it comfortably. She did it anyway because the planting couldn't wait, and because she'd done the calculation and $12 an hour for 3 days was survivable, just barely, and barely was a margin she'd been operating inside all winter. The boy's name was Daniel, and he asked questions while they worked, which she appreciated because questions meant he was paying attention, and attention was the thing she'd concluded mattered most. "What are you planting up here?" he said on the second afternoon. "Cover crop for now, crimson clover and winter rye. It'll fix nitrogen and stop erosion and give me something to turn under in the fall. And then what?" "Then I figure out what the market needs," she said. "Depending on how the cooperative develops, maybe root vegetables. Maybe small grains. I don't know yet." He was quiet for a while, operating the cedar with more confidence than he'd had on day one. "How do you know what to plant if you don't know the market?" he said. "You don't," she said. "That's why you plant something that gives you options while you figure it out." He thought about that. "Cover crop is like buying time," he said. "That's exactly what it is," she said. She paid him at the end of the third day, and he rode his bicycle out the drive, and she stood in the upper field in the late afternoon light and looked at the seeded ground that wouldn't show anything for 2 weeks but was already doing something underneath, and she thought that most of the important things are like that, working without showing, building without announcing, the results arriving later than the effort and rarely on the schedule you'd have chosen. Motset. The bank letter came in the third week of May, and she opened it standing at the mailbox, which she did not normally do. She normally took the mail inside, put it on the kitchen table, and opened it sitting down, because sitting down was something her father had taught her to do with anything from the bank, so your knees didn't go out from under you if it was bad news. She opened it standing at the mailbox because she already knew what it was going to say. She had known since the April payment had cleared, since Sandra Elliott's corrective letter in March, since the production numbers in her notebook had stopped being a question and started being a record. It was the payoff statement, the remaining balance on the Holloway farm loan calculated to the day, including all accrued interest and applicable fees. A number that had been in her head in one form or another for 15 months, that had kept her up at nights and reconfigured itself in her calculations every time she found a new variable, and that was now printed on bank letterhead in a plain font that gave it no drama whatsoever. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the fields, the lower fields that had been fallow when her father died, the upper field she'd seeded 2 weeks ago, the equipment shed with its recently repaired roof, the farmhouse with the porch. Her father had been meaning to reinforce for years, and that she'd reinforced last fall with lumber. She'd cut herself because there was no budget for bought lumber. And the coop, her grandmother's coop, visible from the mailbox if you knew where to look, solid and plain and producing something every single morning without asking for anything beyond feed and water and attention. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and went inside and called the bank and made an appointment. The appointment was on a Friday morning, which meant she had to rearrange the morning coop routine to get there by 9, feeding earlier, collecting before 6, driving to town in the truck that still started on the third try, every time, without variation, a reliability she had long since stopped being grateful for because it had become simply how things were. Sandra Elliott was not what Maris had expected from the phone voice. She was younger, maybe 40, with an organized desk and a manner that was professional without being cold, the kind of professional that comes from actually liking the work rather than performing competence. She looked at Maris's documents, the payoff amount, the check Maris had prepared, the payment history that had been corrected and restored to accurate standing since March, and she processed the transaction with the efficiency of someone for whom this is ordinary, and then she looked up. "The account will be closed today," she said. "You'll receive a release of lien within 30 days. The deed—" "I know the deed," Maris said. "It's in my grandmother's fire safe under the kitchen floor." Sandra Elliott smiled in a way that was brief and genuine. "Then it'll just need the lien release filed with the county recorder. Standard process." "I know the process," Maris said. She signed the paperwork. Sandra Elliott handed her a copy of the payoff receipt, stamped and dated. It was a piece of paper that looked like every other piece of paper involved in this transaction, and it was also the most important piece of paper Maris had held in 15 months. She drove home on the county road in the third try truck, with the windows down because it was May, and the air smelled like cut grass and warming earth, and the particular freshness of a county coming back to life after a winter that had pressed down on it harder than anyone had planned for. She thought about Earl Denton. She had thought about him periodically all winter, when the cold was worst and the numbers were worst, and the silence from him was loudest. She had thought about what he had or hadn't said to the advisory board. She had thought about fair market value and the appraiser he'd mentioned and the way power exercises itself through institutions when it's careful about it. She had thought about her father and whether her father had ever crossed Earl Denton and what that might have produced. And she hadn't reached any conclusions because she didn't have evidence, only the shape of a suspicion that fit the facts she had. She had decided, somewhere in February, to let it be the shape of a thing she knew without pursuing the thing it was the shape of. Not because it didn't matter, but because pursuing it required energy and attention that the farm required more. Not forgiveness. She had not arrived at forgiveness, which was a word she associated with a process she hadn't undergone. Something more like a deliberate choice of where to point her limited resources. She saw him once more, in May, at the feed supply he ran on the main road through town. She was picking up a supplement order, and he was in the back of the store when she came in, and he came forward when he heard the bell over the door and stopped when he saw her. He looked at her for a moment. "Maris," he said. "Earl," she said. He looked like he was deciding something. Then he said, "I heard you made the payoff." News traveled in Carver's Crossing the way it always had, through Ruth Hensley and every other person who handled paper and knew what the paper meant. "I did," she said. He nodded. He did not offer congratulations, which she hadn't expected. He also did not say anything cutting or defensive, which she had half expected. What he did was stand there with the expression of a man who is reassessing something he'd been certain about and finding the reassessment uncomfortable but not avoidable. "Your grandmother would have been pleased," he said. It was the most honest thing he could have said, and the fact that it was honest instead of strategic told her something about him that adjusted her picture of him. Not completely, not in a way that erased the winter's suspicions, but in the way that complexity adjusts pictures when you're paying attention. "She would have said it was the birds," Maris said, "not her." She picked up her supplement order and drove home. The second cooperative meeting, the one with Gerald Foss present, happened on a Saturday in late May at the same back room of Delamarche's feed co-op, and this time there were 11 people instead of 8, which meant the word had traveled and the word had credibility behind it. Gerald Foss arrived with a colleague, a woman named Patricia Huang, who managed the cooperative's producer relations, and who asked better questions than anyone else in the room, which was useful because the meeting needed that. A person whose job was to be unsentimental about what a thing required. They talked for 3 hours. Patricia Huang asked about production consistency, about quality control, about what each producer's plan was for scaling without losing what made their product worth the premium price. She was not skeptical exactly, but she was rigorous, and rigorous was what the conversation needed. At one point she looked at Maris and said, "Your flock is the anchor here. Documented cold climate production through the worst freeze in over a decade. That's a story the Millhaven market can sell, but a flock of 29 is a small anchor." "I know," Maris said. "What's your expansion plan?" "This fall, I'm adding 15 birds from my own breeding stock," Maris said. "Documented Chanticleer lines selected for the traits that held through this winter. By next spring, I'll have a flock of 40 or more, depending on losses." "And after that?" "After that depends on what the market actually absorbs," she said. "I don't expand faster than the market can hold. I've seen what happens when people build ahead of the market." Patricia Huang wrote something down. "That's a conservative position." "It's a solvent position," Maris said. Gerald Foss, who had been mostly listening, said, "It's also the position that produces a sustainable supplier instead of a supplier that scales fast and fails in 2 years." He looked at Patricia. "It's the position I'd want in a long-term producer relationship." Patricia considered this. She was not the kind of person who changed positions easily or without showing the work of changing them. After a moment she nodded, once, which in her communication style appeared to mean something definitive. They reached a framework agreement by the end of the meeting. Not a signed contract, but a structured understanding of what the cooperative would look like, what each producer would commit to, what the Millhaven Agricultural Cooperative would pay, and on what terms. It would take another month of back and forth before anything was signed, but the shape of it existed, in the back room of the feed co-op in Carver's Crossing, on a Saturday in May, with 11 people around a folding table and a thermos of coffee that Calvin Henderson had brought again, because he had decided this was his contribution and he was going to make it every time. Driving home, Maris passed Harlan Pruitt's operation, the long white buildings of his Leghorn operation, which were showing the first signs of coming back to full production, new fencing around the run area, the kind of maintenance activity that happens when an operation is rebuilding after a hard season. She slowed without meaning to, just for a moment, and looked at the empty space where his egg cases had sat stacked against the outside wall in October, cases that had been full when the weather was good and empty when the weather turned real. She did not feel vindicated. Vindication was for arguments, and what had happened this winter had not been an argument she'd won. It had been a problem she'd solved, and other people's losses were not part of the solution she was proud of. What she felt, looking at Harlan's operation, was something closer to the understanding that the county's resilience was not her resilience alone, and that the cooperative idea, which had started with a crisis and a kitchen table in February, was actually about exactly this, making sure that what she knew and what Harlan knew and what Carolyn knew and what Rick Sato was still learning were resources the township had access to, not private advantages that disappeared when the individual who held them ran out of luck. She had been lucky. She needed to be honest about that. As a person who had also been prepared and stubborn and desperate enough to act on incomplete information. Luck and preparation are not opposites. They work together or they don't work at all. The lien release arrived from the county recorder's office on a Wednesday morning in June, 41 days after the payoff, 11 days later than the 30 days Sandra Elliott had cited, because these things always take longer than they're supposed to, which is a fact about institutions that no amount of optimism changes. Maris took it to her grandmother's fire safe, which lived under a hatch in the kitchen floor that her grandmother had built into the original floor plan when she was designing the farmhouse. A practical woman who understood that some things needed to be below the level of disaster. She opened the safe and put the lien release in beside the deed, and she looked at the deed for a moment. Her grandmother's name on it, then her father's, then hers, handwritten corrections made twice in the chain of title over 60 years. And she closed the safe and closed the hatch and stood up. The kitchen looked the way it always looked, the Maxwell House tin on the counter, empty now since she'd moved to the envelope system but kept, because it was the kind of object that accumulates meaning over time and becomes harder to remove the longer it stays. The notebook on the table, 58 pages now, the spring section already developing its own character as the records shifted from winter crisis management to the more ordinary complexity of a farm with a functioning operation and a future that required planning. Emma Taft's card against the backsplash, the chicken or dinosaur drawing faded slightly from being near the window. She made coffee. She sat at the table. She did not have a particular feeling about what had just happened, or she had too many feelings at once, which is a different problem. The kind where the feelings are all real, but they cancel each other into a kind of quiet. She thought about her grandmother building this kitchen, building this farm from nothing in particular, raising a daughter and watching her leave and watching the farm pass to her son-in-law, and then watching him work it for 30 years until his heart stopped. And throughout all of that, keeping Chanticleers in the coop she'd built in 1962 and telling a 12-year-old at this table about the smaller comb and the tighter feathering and the way the cold doesn't take as much from them. The 12-year-old hadn't known she was being handed something. That's how the most important things get passed on. Not as instruction, but as conversation. Not as legacy, but as a Saturday morning with peas to shell and a grandmother who talked while she worked. In July, the first Holloway Farm breeding stock sale happened. It was not what she had planned when she'd thought about breeding stock back in February, when Gerald Foss had first said the phrase and she'd started to understand what he meant. What she had planned was a small, careful transaction. A few hatching eggs to a verified buyer, documented transfer, nothing dramatic. What happened was that the Millhaven Agricultural Cooperative posted about the Chanticleer flock in their producer newsletter, and the newsletter was read by people she'd never heard of. And two of those people contacted Gerald Foss, and Gerald Foss called Maris, and the small, careful transaction became something more organized than she'd been prepared for. She sold hatching eggs to 3 buyers, one from the next county, one from 2 states east, and one from a small farm collective in a northern state that had been trying to reestablish cold climate laying breeds for years and had been looking for documented Chanticleer stock that met the genetic standards they needed. The northern collective paid a price per dozen hatching eggs that made Maris look at the number twice and then called Gerald Foss back to confirm she'd heard it correctly. She had heard it correctly. She kept meticulous records of every egg she sold for hatching, which birds laid them, the breeding pair assignments she'd been managing carefully since March, the hatch dates and conditions she recommended to the buyers. She did not oversell what she had. She told the Northern Collective that she had 29 birds in documented 5th-generation cold climate selection and that she could guarantee the genetics but not the management results, because management was their responsibility and she wouldn't pretend otherwise. The woman from the Northern Collective, a person named Vera, who communicated via phone in one letter and not at all electronically, which Maris respected on instinct, said, "We've dealt with a lot of breeders who sell the genetics and the promise. You're the first one who's told us what you can't promise." "I can't promise something I don't control," Maris said. "No," Vera said, "but most people try." The cooperative held its first formal delivery to the Millhaven market on the last Saturday of August, which was not dramatic in itself. A truck, a loading dock, cases of eggs, and boxes of vegetables and sealed containers of aged cheese and 2 coolers of heritage turkey pieces, but which felt, to the people involved, like something that had been a long time becoming what it was. Maris was there for the loading, not because she had to be, but because she'd helped build the thing and wanted to see it go. Rick Sato was there looking both proud and nervous, in the way of young people who have committed to something and are confronting the reality of it actually happening. Carolyn Vance counted her cheese containers with the focused attention of a person who does not trust other people to count their cheese containers correctly, which was reasonable. Dale and Francis Okafor stood together near their turkey coolers and talked quietly to each other in the way of a couple who have been doing difficult things together for long enough that difficult things have become a shared language. Calvin Henderson had come for no particular professional reason. His eggs weren't part of the Millhaven arrangement. His operation supplied the local accounts. But he'd driven out and was standing near the truck with his hands in his pockets, watching. "You know you didn't have to come," Maris said, standing beside him. "I know," he said. The truck pulled out, and they all watched it go in the way that people watch things they've built going out into the world, with a mixture of satisfaction and the particular anxiety of knowing that you can no longer control what happens to it. "It's going to come back with a payment," Calvin said, mostly to himself. "It's going to come back with the beginning of a track record," Maris said. "The payment comes later." He looked at her. "That's a distinction." "It's the distinction that matters," she said. Fall arrived the way it always did in that county, first in the color of the light, then in the temperature of the mornings, then in the particular smell of cut hay and dried leaves, and the approach of something that would require, again, all the preparation that could be made. Maris added 16 birds to the flock in September. 15 she'd planned for, and one more because the hatch produced one more, and she wasn't going to argue with the arithmetic of a good hatch. She documented every bird, documented the parent pairs, updated the breeding records that had grown from the folded papers she'd found in the crate into a bound record book she'd bought specifically for the purpose. She walked the coop on a morning in mid-September that had the quality of the October morning she'd arrived home with 29 thin, patchy birds in a borrowed crate, the same cold in the air, the same flat sky, the same dry sound of her boots on ground that was remembering how to be hard. The difference was 45 birds instead of 29. The difference was a coop with new boards and well-packed insulation and a water system she'd improved twice over the previous winter. The difference was a notebook with 67 pages of records, and a fire safe, with a deed and a lien release, and a bank account that had not been below zero since February. The difference was also her, which was something she was careful not to make too much of, because the things she was most careful not to make too much of were usually the things that were truest. She was the same person who had stood at an auction in October with $43 and a piece of knowledge she'd inherited, half accidentally, from a woman who shelled peas at a kitchen table. She had not become someone else. What had changed was that the knowledge had been tested and had held, and the holding of it had produced things that were now real. The flock, the records, the cooperative, the deed unencumbered in the fire safe. And real things, once they exist, change the conditions of everything that comes after them. The birds moved around her feet in the coop with their ordinary, confident activity. 43, who had been the thinnest bird at the auction and was now the best layer in the flock, was at the feeders. Ruth was at the water. February was on the roost bar in the particular way she had of sitting higher than the others, which had no practical explanation that Maris had ever been able to determine. She counted them the way she always counted them. All 45 present, all moving, all doing what they were built to do. She latched the coop and walked back to the farmhouse in the September morning with the cold working at the exposed skin of her neck and her hands in her coat pockets, and her boots on the same ground her grandmother had walked to the same coop for 30 years. She had not fixed everything. The upper fields were only 20 acres of 60 possible. The equipment shed roof was holding but would need replacement within 2 years. The market garden she'd planted in the spring had been partially successful and partially educational, which was the kind of result that was honest. She owed favors she hadn't yet repaid. To Tom Birch, whose nephew had cleared the ridge road. To Calvin Henderson and his extra water bucket that she still had in the coop. To Della Marsh, who had been delivering eggs to families on the south end of the township all winter without being asked twice. She had not become the person she was going to be. She was in the middle of becoming her, which was a different condition and a more accurate one. But standing at the kitchen door with the September morning opening up around her, she understood something that she hadn't had words for in October or November, or even in February, when the cold was worst and the math was closest, and she was working inside the smallest margin she had ever worked inside. She understood that the 29 birds had not saved the farm. She had. With what she knew and what she was willing to do with what she knew, which was to act on it when everyone around her was telling her she was wrong, and to keep acting on it through the cold and the silence and the bank letters and Earl Denton's truck in the driveway and the mornings she'd gotten up at 4:30 and gone out into temperatures that wanted to convince her that nothing could hold in this kind of cold. The birds had done what they were built to do. She had done what she had chosen to do, which was a different kind of thing, and the kind that required choosing every single morning. She went inside and made coffee and opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date and the egg count, and below that, because it was September and the cold was coming again and there was work to prepare for, she started a new list. It was long. She started at the top.